got this job at the University of Chicago as a young guy that barely shaved, and I felt I'd give it a try. I had no experience in finding anything. I didn't know I'd be good at it.
Yeah, this is, I think these are cervical.
And that's part of the fun and excitement about science. You never know where it's going to take you. And here I am now, having uncovered approaching 100 tons of material in Africa. We've worked in India, we've worked in Asia, we've worked in South America. We've discovered dinosaurs right and left, flying reptiles, crocodiles 40 feet long. Who could have predicted that? Nobody can. And that's what's the excitement of really of what research science is about. Thank you, sirs. Okay, I'm delighted to be here tonight. It was a big family. 6 kids over 8 years. And one of them, we've all become professors. That wasn't the plan. One of them, Paul Callistus Sereno, was a bit of a black sheep for quite a while. I had brilliant siblings, but when the teachers got me, oh my gosh, they never forgot. And I had quite a rough upbringing in terms of just really liking school. Didn't like it. Never operated well in school. I was also a bit of an accident-prone kid, so that by 6th grade, I think I was unconscious at least 20 times. I was nearly killed by one gym teacher who held me vertically in a move that caused me to swallow my tongue. I was knocked unconscious with a volleyball by the other gym teacher, whom I would later work with in summers when I became a college student. I learned how to faint in church as a way of getting out of church. I tried to derail a train. It wasn't successful. And it was generally, I had this kind of a feeling about school. I remember distinctly in 6th grade thinking, I've only gone through 6 years, and if I can calculate correctly, 6 minus 12 is 6, 6 more years, I'm not going to make it out of high school. A lot of people didn't think I would make it out of high school. And there are lots of kids like me. I see them all the time. I ended up really learning about science and getting a love for biology and actually a feel for adventure and all the things I was doing outside of the classroom. Some of them good, some of them bad. One of the good things I did was my father bought me a butterfly collecting kit. I was afraid to admit that in school, but I went around and with my brother later collected these butterflies outside our fancy suburb of Naperville. It wasn't so fancy then, outside Chicago. And that was my first taste of biology. But this was a real big event for me, this painting, my first on a piece of canvas. My mother was an art teacher, my father a postman, ex-engineer. They just told us to do things, something satisfying in life. Make no small plans. Well, that didn't really come to fruition for me until I made this painting. And then I felt for the first time that I could do something. Those pots were made by my brother. And I felt I had a career. I was going to be an artist. So I got a dictionary, and I actually read the dictionary because I was so far behind in vocabulary that it was a question whether I would get into college. I worked my way into Northern Illinois University as an art student. And these were drawings I did in life drawing class. It's clear there was some talent there, but there's something else going on subliminally, even before I thought about paleontology. I was seeing bones when I shouldn't be. This was actually a living person. And actually, it turns out that the line between science and art is a fuzzy one and a very short one indeed. To this day, I have people telling me that the art in what I do is in making up the parts that don't exist. The imagination is only limited to what doesn't exist. And I think that's a very limiting view of what art actually has to offer a scientist like myself. I think it comes into play in every aspect of what we do. I think it's why I can find things in the field. Because I can take the anatomy of bones, and when I see only a part of it, I can think about the other part that's in the ground.
Specimens of Negeosaurus, but here's the transition from the neck to the back. We may not have that in any other specimen.
And if there's anything we need to do in science, it's to think about ideas that haven't been thought about before. Think about hypotheses that maybe you don't have a lot of evidence for it, but then you can go out and test. And what I've spent the last 25 years doing is trying to do that with dinosaur bones. What I try to do is understand the distortion in Negeosaurus. I realize the distortion in Negeosaurus when I link it to another dinosaur and try to understand what those distortions mean. We're going to go back on a time trip back to the Mesozoic. A story I tell is a Mesozoic story. This is a picture of the continents floating around. It's a little bit after when the chapter I'm going to talk about today, but it's about 80 million years ago. You see how small the Atlantic Ocean is. Well, it got smaller as you go back in time. It gets so small that Africa touches South America. And just at that point, when there was still some contact, that's when we're going to go into Africa and see what was alive 110 million years ago. Africa, of course, now has an enlarged desert in the north here. There's no roads that actually cross it. And the country where my colleagues come from is blessed. Niger, it's located about here, is blessed, and I say blessed, with a section of that desert. It's a gorgeous place to visit. I always wanted to cross it, just like I wanted to go down the Mississippi River as a kid. I said, I can't live a full life unless I've crossed the Sahara once. It is such a magnificent, enormous habitat. You can be in a place and look all around you for miles and miles and see sand and rock. And in fact, in some places, you can see more dinosaur bone than anywhere else on the continent. That's the place I'm going to take you now. It's called Gadufao, the place where camels fear to tread. And humans must fear to tread there more if camels don't like the place. You can't take a normal thermometer that only goes up to 120, otherwise you'll never know how hot it is. And you need to think about other things like dehydrated food. If you're going to take a big group of, say, 20 people, and they're going to be working as hard as they've ever worked in their life, digging up 10, 20 tons of rock and bone, you got to feed them. So you got to think of a lot of things. You got to put it all in a car. You can't take anything that's not absolutely necessary, and everything that is, except water, that you got to find and transport, which is a major problem in and of itself. And then you go driving into the desert. This is actually one time in which we actually drove all the way down. We've done it twice, drove all the way down to Niger from Europe and drove back. This is Algeria. It's a land inhabited by a very interesting nomadic people, the Tuaregs. These people have lived for hundreds, in fact, thousands of years in the desert, leading a nomadic life, at first without camels, and then later during historical periods with camels, raising goats and mutton and trading camels. And it's an absolutely fantastic culture where the men wear veils and carry swords. You go to their homeland, the biggest oasis where Tuareg culture can be seen up close at Agadez. You've probably heard of the town. Located on the edge of a small and low mountain range called the Aïr. And there you see the Aïr, and there you see the Tenere Desert coming into the Aïr from the east side. You follow those dunes and try to avoid them as you go east into the place called Gadufao. And it looks like this. If you've got good eyes, you'll see our camp. Look at that. With GPS, of course, we can find our way in. We can often find our way out. We can find fossils that we've found. It makes planning a year's expedition a great pleasure and something that's much more possible to do because we can always find a fossil once you've left it a month later. But this is the playground for where we have spent several years finding fossils. There's more fossils here in these little patches of rock than anywhere else in Africa. It's going to give us, and it's going to give all of Africa, an incredible picture of fossils 110 million years ago. If you go other places, you can move up in time to 90 million. If you go other places, you can move back in time to 135 million years. That's why, before we leave Niger, we have to leave it with the world's best dinosaur museum, which we intend to do in the next years. Now, I'm just getting, this is way out of date now because we've added a number of species to this picture. But going back to that map that I showed you in the Mesozoic world, especially in the latter part of the Mesozoic world, those continents have drifted apart. It doesn't take long, 5 to 10 million years, before species in isolation will diverge on their own path. Evolution is a creative process that ultimately takes advantage of opportunities so varied that we can't predict its path over time. It repeats itself in different ways and shapes, but you can't predict it. If you take a continent, send it on its own course somewhere, new forms, new species will evolve. And so the world that I'm going to describe to you is extreme by our standards. We don't have anything to judge it by. Our standards being North American dinosaurs, which we've known for more than a century. The dinosaurs I grew up on, the books, it's nothing like that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. I'm going to tell you about this layer here in the middle 110 million years ago and some of these species here that we've named from that level. You walk into the desert, you find a 6-foot jaw. But that jaw doesn't belong to a dinosaur. It belongs to an enormous crocodile. Here we are laying down behind the jaw in a photograph that was published in Nat Geographic. It took us a lot to lay there. The ground was 150 degrees. We were baking, and they said, just one more photograph. This animal we found a lot of. But it was quite a story in terms of putting it together. But we got most of this animal together. We size adjusted the parts. It was, to our mind, the world's largest crocodile. In fact, here it is with a modern crocodile jaw in its jaws. Truly how big it was, however, was something to really marvel at. And marvel at indeed when you reconstruct it in 3 dimensions. I contacted an artist. We adjusted all the sizes. I gave him a cast of the skull, a cast of the scutes, and he needed to buy 2 tons of putty. He built something which looked like an airplane, to which he covered with putty, and he did a beautiful sculpting job. I never thought it would take me to Costa Rica, a fossil crocodile from the Sahara taking me to Costa Rica and also to India to measure gharials, but it really has stood the test of time as the bona fide test of the actual figuring out how big the largest crocodile was.
Let's get this tape measure on him. Whoa, right there. Wow.
Super croc was one of a couple of strange things that we found in the desert. One of the other ones was found here. Look at that claw. It was sitting there. I think no nomads even passed this corner of Geographic, otherwise someone probably would have picked up that claw. It's a really magnificent claw. And what I saw when I came to this site was a fibula here. It's a little bone in the leg. That claw, in general, matched the fibula. In other words, I could use my artist's mind and I could use my anatomist's mind to think that this really was matching. That fibula belonged to a predatory dinosaur. That's indicating that there could be more in there. And we dug in. And some years later, on this stage, we put together for the first time the spinosaur called Suchomimus. It was the first spinosaur that was resurrected in 3 dimensions. It's a very strange kind of predator. But the skull, more than anything else, took the cake. No one had actually found enough of a spinosaur skull to realize that their skull was, as it were, just pulled out like putty. It's like you took a tyrannosaur skull, shaved off the eyebrows, and just pulled it out to a length that just is extreme. No one had ever seen a predatory dinosaur that looked like that. The most appropriate name? Crocodile mimic. It was trying to be a crocodile. After all, it had a skull that looked like one almost, a little bit narrower than most. It had teeth that were for snaring fish, and probably also eating other kinds of animals, but none that it would take down with such a fragile skull. For that, it emphasized the forelimbs, 4-foot-long forelimbs, with foot-long claws that in life would have been about 16 inches. It has the most powerful hands and forelimbs of anything that ever walked on land on 2 legs. Closest thing, maybe a giant ground sloth. This thing was monstrous. And it probably used its forelimbs to take down things that it couldn't with its skull. Absolutely bizarre animal. Now, one bizarre animal that we brought here on the display outside, and so I want to talk about that one in particular a little bit more, is this pterosaur. We haven't given a name to this pterosaur yet. We plan to name it when we publish at length on the scientific, on the remains of the pterosaur, but we have reconstructed it here. And what we found was one of its beautiful wing fingers, and we also found parts of the skull. And so I'd like to show you a little bit about what this pterosaur caused us to think about. It has teeth, clearly, for snaring fish. And yet, how did that work? Could it have done it from the air? If not, we think we have a very clumsy animal to be doing it from all 4s. It perplexes aerodynamicists because they think that it would have to stall at too slow of a speed for an animal that size to actually recover without falling into the water. Yet we look at the animal, look at its neck, look at footprints, and they say it's clumsy, 4-legged, and really couldn't catch a thing with its jaws if it was on the ground. Here's another problem we found in 1997. It's a creature you see outside underneath the pterosaur that I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. an animal that will challenge biomechanics as to how it ate and fed that elephant-sized body for years to come. It was found by this team, 1997. Here we are taking a photograph a couple of minutes after finding the skull, pulled apart with a little jawbone at the surface there and fragile neck bones coming to the surface and being planed off, actually, by the desert wind. The bones are so fragile that the sand and wind plane them off almost flat the moment they come to the surface. So this had seen several centuries of weathering before we found it. Now, Jeff, then a student, now a professor at University of Michigan, and I butted our heads up getting over the specimen to figure out what it was. It was originally thought to be maybe a predator. It was so fragile. But we quickly saw a stack of teeth in one of the jaw bones. We both realized it was some kind of funky sauropod, lighter than anything we'd ever seen before. We had no idea what it looked like at that point. That would require a lot of digging. This is a little closer up view of the rock to show you this is purple sandstone, pure sandstone. You can carve it with a good chisel and a bit of work. And that's what we had to do. We had to carve it out. We had to wrap it in wood cover. We were using the wood for struts, cover it with plaster, and then actually get under it. You got to chisel your way under it. The bigger the block, the harder that is. That's just the beginning. Then we take it back to a laboratory, and there'll be hours and hours of cleaning. How about this one? This is a skeleton of Nigersaurus found in 2000. That's Gabrielle Lyon in the middle of this tail. Tail's curving this way. That's the distal end. Coming around. Here's the pelvic girdle, and here's the dorsal column. We've brushed back the sand of the desert. You see the tan sand? That's the purple rock underneath. So fragile that it was planed completely flat. You'd walk right over a 30-foot animal without even knowing it. In fact, we did a couple of times before someone spotted it. Some of these blocks, extremely fragile, like this tail block here she's working her way around, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds by the time we turned it over. You have to turn it over with a vehicle. Inside the bones of a fragile animal. So fragile that you could see light through some of the cranial bones. This is the cheekbone with the light passing through it. It was so fragile that we said we really couldn't take the chance of casting and molding it by normal procedures, which is putting silicone rubber over it, making a mold, pulling it apart, putting plastic inside. It wouldn't survive. We can withstand a break or two, but not 10 or 15 or 20 that would destroy the bone. And so we opted to take these bones, plead with the airlines so we could take a big box on board and take it over to the best CAT scanner we had, an industrial CAT scanner, so we could make computerized versions of these bones, see inside them, and make copies. And when we didn't have a right, but had a left, we could make that right with a flick of a switch. And so we did. We took this bone, this is a CAT scan of the bone, and that's a cheekbone, and see those two extra holes? Those are extra holes found only in Nigersaurus, just for the fun of it. There are 5 extra holes only found in this dinosaur. So not pathologic. There's nothing pathologic about them. But it gives you some idea of how thick this bone is. It's about 1 millimeter thick. It forms the side of the cheek of this dinosaur. Now, here's a look at a reconstruction of the tooth batteries. I found a bone that was so bizarre. Initially, when we had begun to clean it off in the lab, I disowned it. I said all the rest of the bones belong to this dinosaur, but not this one. I tried anything. I went to a colleague, worked on amphibians. Did this belong to a fish? I knew there was a coelacanth in the rivers there. And he said, no. And I said, well, one day I was watching and studying and fiddling with these bones, and all of a sudden it came to me. Maybe it had no tooth sockets. Maybe it had a giant trough because the bones were replacing, there's no sauropod like that. Maybe all the teeth were at the end of the jaw. Somehow, in my mind, my artist's mind, I turned it around and I began to see the face of a dinosaur that we really had never seen before. And I called up Jeff on the phone. And I said, Jeff, you're not going to believe this. We have a fern mower. At that point, I was just getting an idea of what this dinosaur looked like, that its teeth weren't in sockets. Like a few very distant bird hip dinosaurs who had developed tooth batteries on the sides of their jaws, this dinosaur had done what no other dinosaur had done, and put all the teeth at the end of the jaw, increased the tooth replacement rate till it had hundreds of teeth in its jaw holding themselves into place and coming out of the jaw en masse. Several hundred below, several hundred above. But different than an ornithischian, only one tooth in each column would be active at a time, creating a scissors edge 10 inches wide, above and below, to crop plants like we'd never seen before. Now, we had never seen a set of jaws like this before in any dinosaur, so I excused myself for not recognizing the jawbone until it was almost virtually clean. We began to put the skull together. And what emerged was a Darth Vader dinosaur, something I'd never really imagined until we really tried to put it all together. But we had so many of the bones that there was no cause for thinking that we had made a mistake. We went back over and over again, but you're left with very little wiggle room when you have 80% of the skull. So here we have, just to orient you, the nice round eye socket. Here's the nose. It's the nose opening in the skull. Here's the tooth, and the teeth extend all the way up into the jaws. So here's a couple of extra holes in the lower jaw, all of it very thin. And, well, we took that model, which was made from computerized prototypes, the first time that had ever been done, and we passed it back through the CAT scan machine so we could have a complete computerized version of the skull. Then, in the computer, we could cut it in half. We could cut it in any direction we want. So the red cross sections you see, I did in the computer, and I calculated the area of those cross sections because that bone is the bone that connects this eating machine at this end to the back end of the skull. Whatever forces are at work at the jaw are going to have to be transmitted and absorbed by the bone connecting it to the rest of the skull, which is connected to the neck. Less than a square half-inch of bone, taking all of the bone into account. It's staggering. And it's going to keep those engineers puzzled over how this dinosaur did it. But truly, it is a dinosaur and a face that nobody has ever seen on land before. When you say that as a paleontologist, that's a pretty heavy statement, that no tetrapod in the last 350 million years on land has ever taken the jaws and put all the teeth at the distal end. Why not? Because it's the farthest point from the muscles, the farthest point from the jaw joint. No dinosaur has ever put tooth batteries at the end of their jaws. No dinosaur has ever taken the jaws and extended them beyond the side of the face. Why? Because it's a dangerous thing to do. You grab something in this side of your jaws, it better be something awful soft. So we have an animal here that really broke a lot of rules. Those rules are, anytime you want to make chewing a true matter of life like mammals, you're going to develop big muscles. You're going to develop coronoid processes. You're going to make your bones more robust. You're going to close the openings of the skull. We've seen this happen several times, especially in those dinosaurs that developed the tooth batteries. But not in Dinosaurs. It's able to break the rules. And so we wonder why. We look at the skull now, the CAT scan of the skull rotating, just to see a little bit how thin some of these bones are. It really is a featherweight skull. But that's not where our investigation would stop. We wanted to understand what was the orientation of such a bizarre skull, such an extreme skull. Well, I had my notions. With a big flat muzzle like that, I had my notions that it was probably munching something close to the ground. But how could I prove that independent of the bones themselves? Well, it turns out if you look into the ear region of the dinosaur from the CAT scans, we could in fact reproduce its brain space. We could do more than that. We could go in and visualize the organ of equilibrium, the semicircular canals inside the sidewall of the brain case. The only way you can see that without a CAT scan is take a hammer to the skull and break it apart. We weren't going to do that. It's the only specimen. But we could see it on the CAT scan. We rebuilt it. Here it is here, in pink, the 3 semicircular canals that allow me to talk without falling over and move around. There's one canal, the horizontal canal, on the side, that in a human skull will give you the habitual posture when you put it into a horizontal position. In human, it puts your head like this. We've used that in other kinds of living animals and fossil animals to determine the orientation of the skull. So naturally, that was what I was after in Dinosaurs. I wanted to know what was the habitual posture of the skull. And so after we had extracted the brain, which was the first for a sauropod where we could see the cerebrum, the forebrain, the thinking part of the brain, this little swollen area, a little less impressive when I tell you that, yes, it is the size of the proverbial walnut. But it was enough to live on for this animal, live very successfully. The part that smells, the olfactory bulbs here, we have one of these out on display, colored so that you can see them. But this internal organ here is what I was after in particular. And when you put that in a horizontal position like this, and here you can see the rotation, we put this in, we built this in a computer, and you see the little semicircular canals, that's the solid bone that's around that. And we oriented the skull, this is the orientation that we got. And it was a shocker to me. I didn't tell the person who I had brought onto the project to reconstruct the semicircular canals where it was positioned in the skull. And he sent me those results, and I was amazed and stunned. We had, in fact, found a fern mower that was sticking its snout directly towards the ground most of the time. Now, this is how we would orient the skull in an anatomical description. 90 degrees to what we would normally do. This is not the top of the skull on average. That's the front of the skull. And here's the lower jaws. Again, bizarre by all standards. We wanted to investigate the teeth as well, because when we unveiled this thing, it was going to be quite a sensation. It's going to cause a lot of people headaches from what they had said in the past, and maybe headaches from trying to predict how the skull handled it. And we wanted to get as much information as we could from the teeth. So here's a tooth blown up. There's a wear facet on the inside, this is an upper tooth, and a wear facet on the outside. The perfect tooth would look like a cone. It would come to a top. And as it wore, it developed facets, wear facets that would tell us what it was doing with its teeth. One was pretty clear enough. This was produced by another tooth, a nice flat wear facet. As the jaws came together, they came together very precisely and slid past each other, snipping off plants along the entire row synchronously. There's another wear facet on the outside of the teeth, a wedge-shaped wear facet. This one, when you look at it under the microscope, was caused by abrasion against plants, abrasion against something, because it's on the outside of the teeth. And when we look inside the teeth, you cut a cross-section like this, and I found we had one spare jaw with a couple of teeth in it. And so here's that slice. And here's a piece of the tooth expanded up. It looks like you're looking at petrified wood with tree rings, because that's what it is. And it happens in our teeth too. Under a magnifying lens, you can see rings in our teeth. They were laid down every day in the development of the tooth. So you can tell how old that tooth is. And if you calculate and add up the rings in one tooth, and you happen to have the tooth that's succeeding it, you can calculate the rate at which they were replacing. And we calculated that rate, and it sets an all-time record for dinosaurs. 30 days, plus or minus a few. 1 month is what a tooth lasted in the jaw of Dinosaurs, which is incredible rate of tooth replacement. That's part of the reason why it had to have 10 teeth in a column, because it takes a certain amount of time to create a tooth. And so if you want to wear your teeth down that rapidly, you have to start reproducing your teeth before the other one wears out. You have to have many teeth in the process of formation. So with that, we're able to sort of get a picture of what this dinosaur was like. It was muzzle down most of the time. It had hundreds of teeth in its jaws and one sharp edge like a scissors at the front of its jaws for operating. Now that's the first stage of reconstruction, and this is painting. We are in good stead with dinosaurs when we're doing reconstruction. A lot of people think that it's just all guesswork. I mean, after all, there's no skin preserved, right? It's just all, well, not really. It's guesswork to a certain level, but a lot of it is based on what we know from living reptiles. Fortunately, this is a human face and not a real one. It's a drawing, a painting. But it shows all the muscles in the face, the muscles I'm using to talk and articulate with and so on. These are actually not present in any living reptile. We don't think they're present in dinosaurs. They're not present in birds or crocodiles. So we don't have to worry about those, fortunately. It's really much more hard to reconstruct a mammal face because of all these extra muscles that migrate out into the face, especially a human, to give us muscles of expression. We think dinosaurs were less emotive that way. They would have grunted and groaned, but they couldn't make faces at you quite that way. So reconstructing them is a lot easier. You just need to stick to the bones. And you need to look at those bones. You need to see if you can see any vessels. If you see impressed vessels, that means the skin was tight. You don't see them, the skin was a little bit looser. If you see ornamented ridges in living reptiles, it means there was scales that might have been a little bit larger because there might have been some contact there. And so we've done it in the computer, putting skin over a CAT scan of the skull. And so here you see the skull. And here you see the skin over the skull. So it's done by a student. We can also do it physically, and we think this is one of the most accurate reconstructions of a sauropod, built right over a copy of the skull. Again, ornamented where we see rough skin, turning to keratin like a bill where we see the impressed vessels, and that's our best guess, that there was some kind of a bill, again, for protection against rubbing against something in the course of the life of this animal. We put a big tongue in here because, in fact, almost all dinosaurs have two big tongue bones that indicate they did have a loose and free tongue that was used for manipulating plant matter. This was a dinosaur that was this was a fern mower. It was dedicated an eating machine for cropping plants, slicing them off. It was not chewing its cud like a cow. The tongue would rapidly move the food back, plant matter back for processing and perhaps fermenting in the gut. What about the body? Well, Nigersaurus's body was on our mind for quite some time. This is what we do for fun in the middle of the Sahara. We open up the exposure on a flashlight, and you take a flashlight, open up the camera, you draw a dinosaur in the pitch blackness, throw the flashlight down, and then pose for a little flash with your drawing. And not a bad rendition when we hadn't built the skeleton yet. So here's a look 10 years after the initial discovery, after all the bones have been prepared. It was a forensic case. We had to take about 5 skeletons and overlap them. I chose the skeleton with the skull. That skeleton went back to the base of the neck. There was another skeleton that started before the base of the neck and went into the back series. Then there was a skeleton I showed you a picture of that took from the base of the neck, went through the dorsal series and out through the pelvic girdle and into the tail. And then we had another one that started in the middle of the tail and went out to the end of the tail. We were missing some bones. We had about 80% of the bones. Where we had a right limb, it was just as good as having a right and a left limb. You put all the information together, we had 80% of the skeleton, and I think we have a pretty good idea of what it looked like. It had a long neck, but short by sauropod standards. Nigersaurus belongs to a tightly knit group of species, most of which we found the last 25 years, with the weird name of Rabachisaurid sauropods, named after a good Italian Rabacci. No one has ever seen what one of these dinosaurs looked like as a whole skeleton. This is the first skull. More distantly, it's related to Diplodocus. And like Diplodocus, many of its bones are hollowed by air sacs that extend from the lung. In the neck, this leaves a very hollow vertebra. Not only is it pushed in from the side with hollow air sacs, but they invade the bone to hollow out the inside. You can see this extreme condition in a vertebra from the back. Here's a big hole. Air tracts coming back from the lungs go inside the vertebrae, leaving you this in cross-section. It's more air than bone. There's more air in the column that is supporting the weight of this animal than bone. You want to calculate the weight of this animal, you calculate its volume, and then you subtract about 20% or 15% for air. We don't think of that normally when we think about elephants and rhinos and hippos because these are mammals, and mammals never do this. You got to remember that as far as this looks from a bird is its closest relative among living animals. And birds do this all the time. Birds are typically about 20% air sacs from the lung. This animal was trying to lighten itself to the point of absurdity. We're going to hand that off to the biomechanics to explain how it could get away with lightening the skeleton as much as it did. It wasn't, I don't think, a flotation device. I think it was just trying to reduce the amount of living tissue it had to support and still get by. And it was doing it quite successfully because it was the most common large herbivore of the day, along with one other herbivore in the beds in Ischugalasto. This is a closer look at the dorsal vertebra to show you what a cross-section looks like through here. I mean, you can't pick up these vertebrae when they're fossil. They just crumble. In life, they would have been stronger than that, but they are really a biomechanical wonder that they supported an animal that even taking 15% air would weigh as much as an Indian elephant. And here we have the picture of Nigersaurus after putting that story together. Now, sauropods have gone through a lot. What was Nigersaurus doing with a head like that and a body like that? Well, first we thought that the bodies of these animals were so heavy, they must have had to have lived in water. We had them in marshes. And all the time when I was a kid, they were always in the marshes pulling up, I don't know, marine plants of some sort at the top of a tall neck. as I'm telling you, most of these animals are at least 15% air, because they all have air pockets, although Nigersaurus takes it to an extreme. The neck, well, the longest necked animal we build our models on is a giraffe. And giraffe's neck, obviously, is to let it eat and browse in the trees. But ourselves and our mammal cousins are not necessarily the best model for a bird-like animal. And so closer study of the neck of Brachiosaurus and many other sauropods, but including Brachiosaurus, shows us that the neck was much lower. We cannot justify turning the neck at almost 45 degrees upwards to justify this pose. And so the necks came down. But it's a giraffe that ultimately this was built on. And so we would typically get these kinds of images of sauropods. We're not sure at this point if many sauropods had their necks up at all, but certainly they didn't have them up that high. Now, some people did think that some dinosaurs were low browsers, browsing close to the ground, but they were usually late in the Cretaceous. And the idea from Bob Bacher, published in 1986, was that, well, maybe they even invented flowers by destroying plants close to the ground. They gave rise to the weedy angiosperm flowers and plants that we have today. And they occur about the same time, the duckbills at the end of the Cretaceous and angiosperms. But we're dealing with already with Nigersaurus, which is older, 110 million years. And quite frankly, if you look at others of its kin, Diplodocus in particular, these go back to the Upper Jurassic. So what were these animals eating? Well, first, again, Diplodocids, the group that Nigersaurus is closest to, have very long necks. And Bob Bacher also said that these might have given rise to the tallest, the canopy eaters. Maybe they got up on their tail and their hind legs in a tripodal posture, allowing them to get up to 40 feet to munch on these conifers, these Araucarian or monkey puzzle-like trees in the canopy. Well, again, studies in detail really have not justified that in the last 15 years. The vertebrae in natural pose, when you pose them carefully and look at their articulations, in fact show a very horizontal neck. And this was reconstructed correctly by some scientists who actually had to reconstruct the bones in museums. In fact, you don't see a curve like this. Maybe it could have taken that curve, but you don't see a curve like this, and we don't imagine it arising like this from the back. And the other thing is that the head, well, the first time a good Diplodocus skull and anterior part of the neck was found, the scholar here in Washington said in the 19 teens, I can't reconstruct the head pointing forward. Just like the problems we have with Nigersaurus. He said the head had to be reconstructed tipped down. But we tend to forget these things because our model always tends to be mammals, the animals we're closest to. In fact, the other thing about an animal like a giraffe is that if it was eating up in the trees, it tends to have a narrow muzzle. Mammal workers have known this for years. You can go into the Serengeti, line up all the ungulates, measure their snouts. The ones that are broad are eating grass. The ones that are sort of in between are eating some grass, some leaves. The ones that are narrow like this are always browsers. You wouldn't want a big muzzle. You're reaching in between the trees to get at leaves. You want something that's narrow. Nigersaurus gave us all pause because there were so many constraints. It was such an extreme dinosaur. You couldn't get its face any more forward than in the model outside, about tipping 45 degrees. You could not put the face pointing forwards. Otherwise, the neck would have to come directly from underneath, and there's absolutely no way the neck could handle that position. The ear region told us its snout is pointed down. It has a giant flat muzzle. What could it be doing except cropping plants close to the ground? That's what we had to argue it was doing. The problem is it has wear facets on the teeth that closely resemble Diplodocus. Not only that, here's the front part of the jaws. Diplodocus has the big front jaws. Diplodocus has teeth that are almost all up front. Not all up front, but almost all up front. Diplodocus, when you x-ray Diplodocus like we did, has 5 or 6 teeth in a column in these innocent-looking jaws. In addition, its ear region says that this, not this, is the habitual posture of the skull. It too had a downwardly directed snout, as was reconstructed in the early part of the century. So we've come to the conclusion that we really have missed the boat on some of these sauropods. Indeed, there were large areas of land in the Upper Jurassic covered by ferns, covered by horsetails, covered by lycopods, other kinds of plants. By Nigersaurus's day, it's entirely possible that some angiosperms had come into play and that these dinosaurs were actually browsing near ground level. So here's a picture of, this is the first time that we've been able to CAT scan and reconstruct the brain of a variety of dinosaurs and look at an evolutionary transformation. Here's the brains of all these dinosaurs. This is a prosauropod or early sauropodomorph. It's from where a closely related and ancient group that the sauropods came from. And here, there's a horizontal canal. This is Camarasaurus. This is Diplodocus. And here's Nigersaurus. And you can see how the snout slowly moves down while we hold the brain in a constant position. There really was the evolution of the downturning of the snout in the Diplodocids at the same time that the snout was becoming square, at the same time that tooth replacement was being increased against the wear that was occurring on them. So maybe it wasn't monkey puzzle trees, the conifers that were common, that we have a big chunk of outside. We did find them at Nigersaurus. That's all the plant remains you typically find in the field. Unless you can get pollen, and we couldn't so far get any pollen, you're left with the big trunks of these Araucarian conifer trees. There's a 300-pounder outside for you to take a look at. Those are very useful. You can cut them and slice them, look at them under the microscope, and tell all sorts of things about the climate and how lovely it was during Nigersaurus's day. But did Nigersaurus really eat the leaves of these plants? The jaw, to me, how weak it was in terms of its construction, how wide it was in terms of what it was cutting, and the orientation of the skull say no. It was a ground-level browser. And that ground-level browser, so extreme, has opened my mind to viewing other diplodocids also as ground browsers, ground-level browsers, the cows of the Mesozoic, if you will. So here's a fern. It was a common plant all through the early part of the Mesozoic. Here's a horsetail. These are common today. They grow everywhere from the Arctic down to my garden in Chicago. They're called scouring rushes because you can actually scour plants. There's so much phytolith in the outside levels of their structure that they really are very abrasive. And in the Mesozoic, it's not well studied. Some of them were less abrasive, some of them more. It's not really well studied. But maybe that was what was abrading the teeth at such a rate. And then, of course, around around this plant here, you see some of the angiosperms that were coming into disturbed environments, maybe along the riverways. But for Nigersaurus, again, you have to ask yourself, this is a common dinosaur. Whatever food it was accessing, it had to have been common. And then it had relatives like Diplodocus living in arid environments. So I think we may have to reinterpret how these dinosaurs were making a living. Now, there are certain areas that dinosaurs never adapted to. One of those is an aquatic lifestyle. No dinosaur has ever really got a fin, a tail fin, or anything like that. And yet this is an animal, the only mammal that we know of that actually grazes underwater. One of the questions with Nigersaurus is, could it be eating aquatic plants? Well, we have one grazer of grass underwater, and this is what it looks like. And to me, it bears a remote resemblance to Nigersaurus, but it doesn't have teeth at all that resemble anything like Nigersaurus. And there's other environments that we are just learning now that some dinosaurs invaded that we had previously never thought housed dinosaurs. Burrowing habits. This is, of course, an armadillo. We've just described a burrowing dinosaur, and I think we found another one in Africa that we're going to announce soon. It's got arms that are stubby. It has legs that can run. There's nothing quite like it alive today. There's nothing that burrows that runs as fast as a zebra. There's nothing because the burrowers today, and in fact, all mammals, came from a quadrupedal heritage, a four-legged heritage. Dinosaurs, even sauropods, come from a bipedal heritage. We are very unusual among mammals in walking on two legs. It's a very late feature in the course of our evolution. So when you go outside and you look at Nigersaurus, you say it's four-legged. Yes, it is, but it returned to four legs, and it's passed as a two-legged animal. It never left far behind. Look at the size of the hind limbs relative to the forelimbs. It once was, in the very distant past in its lineage, a bipedal animal. So when you devise a way to burrow and make a living, they're doing it with their hands, but they're retaining the ability to run fast with their legs. It's sort of like a burrowing ostrich. I mean, it's just really an incredible kind of animal. In the trees? Well, not too many, but we're now getting a few dinosaurs that we think actually were arboreal before the bird radiation appeared to occupy those niches. But we must admit that in the trees, in burrows, and in the water, dinosaurs had but a precarious existence. So there are areas that dinosaurs didn't excel at particularly well. But we hope that we have at least revealed some of the mysteries of an extreme dinosaur, because an extreme dinosaur like Mesosaurus, quite frankly, gives you clues as to what many of its kin might have been doing. Sometimes it takes an extreme dinosaur to do that. Thank you very much. Take questions.